The Education of Little Tree by Forrest Carter. Willow John, page 766. Planting is a busy time. Grandpa decided when we would begin. He would run his finger into the ground and feel for the warmth, then shake his head, which meant we wasn't going to start planting. So we would have to go fishing or berry picking or general woods rambling if it wasn't the week to work at the whiskey trade. Once you start planting, you have to be careful. There are times when you can't plant. You must begin by remembering that anything growing below ground, such as turnips or taters, these have to be planted in the dark by the moon. Otherwise, your turnips and taters won't be any bigger than a pencil. Anything that grows above the ground, such as corn, beans, peas, and such, must be planted in the light of the moon. If it isn't, you'll not make much of a crop of it. When you have figured this out, there are other things. Most people go by the signs in the almanac. For example, you plant running beans when the sign is in the arms to make the best beans. If you don't, you'll have a lot of blooms but no beans. There is a sign for everything. Grandpa, however, didn't need an almanac. He went by the stars direct. He'd sit on the porch in the spring night, and Grandpa would study the stars. He would have them set how they formed on the ridge of the mountain. He would say, "Stars are right for running beans. We'll plant some tomorrow if the east wind ain't blowing." Even with the stars right, Grandpa would not plant running beans if the east wind was blowing. He said the beans would not produce. Then, of course, it could be too wet or too dry to plant. If the birds quietened it down, you didn't plant either. Planting is a pretty tedious proposition. When we got up in the morning, we might be all set to do some planting, going by the stars the night before, but right off, we could see that the wind was not right, or the birds, or it could be too wet or too dry, so we would have to go fishing. Grandma said she suspicioned some of the signs had to do with Grandpa's fishing feelings. But Grandpa said women couldn't understand complications. He said women thought everything was simple and plain out, which it wasn't. He said women couldn't help it because they was born suspicious in the first place. Grandpa said he had seen day-old females that looked suspicious at a sucking tit. When the day was just right, we planted corn mostly. That was our main crop, for we depended on it for eating and feeding old Sam, and it was our money crop in the whiskey trade. Grandpa laid off the rows with the plow, and old Sam. I didn't lay off any rows. Grandpa said I was mostly a turning plow man. Me and Grandpa dropped the seeds in the rows and covered them up. On the sides of the mountain, Grandpa planted the corn with a Cherokee planting stick. You just jab it in the ground and drop in the seed. We planted lots of other things: beans, okra, taters, turnips, and peas. We planted peas around the fringe of the patch near the woods. This attracted deer in the fall. Deer are crazy about peas and will come 20 miles through the mountains to a pea patch. We always got an easy deer for winter meat. We also planted watermelons. Me and Grandpa picked out a shady end of the patch and planted watermelons pretty heavy. Grandma said it was a mighty big watermelon patch, but Grandpa said what he couldn't eat, we could always tote to the Crossroads store and more than likely make a lot of money selling them. The way it turned out, by the time the watermelons got ripe, me and Grandpa found out the watermelon market had collapsed. Excuse me. The best you could get for the biggest watermelon you had was a nickel, if you could sell it, which wasn't likely. Me and Grandpa figured it out on the kitchen table one evening. Grandpa said that a gallon of whiskey weighed about 8 or 9 pounds, for which we got $2, and he didn't hardly see no way in the world that we could tote a 12-pound watermelon to the Crossroads store for a nickel, not lest the whiskey trade fell through, which was not likely. I told Grandpa it looked to me like we would have to eat all them watermelons. Watermelons are mighty near the slowest growing things ever planted. Beans get ripe, okra, peas, just about everything, and the watermelons just lay there, continual, green and growing. I checked on the watermelons, fairly heavy. When you are certain that the watermelons is ripe, they're not. Finding and testing out a ripe watermelon is might near as complicated as planting. Several times at the supper table, I told Grandpa that I suspicioned I had found a ripe watermelon. I checked the patch every morning and evening, sometimes at dinner time too, if I was passing by. Each time we'd go up to the patch and Grandpa would check it out. It wouldn't be ready. One evening at the supper table, I told Grandpa that I was mighty near certain that I had found the watermelon we was looking for, and he said we would check it out next morning. I was up early waiting. We got to the patch before sunup, and I showed Grandpa the watermelon. It was dark green and big. Me and Grandpa squatted down by the watermelon and studied it. I had already studied it pretty heavy the evening before, but I went over it again with Grandpa. After we studied it a while, Grandpa decided it looked near enough ripe to give it the thump test. You have to know what you're doing to thump test a watermelon and make any sense out of it. If you thump it and it sounds like a think, it is total green. If it sounds thank, it is green but is coming on. If it goes thunk, then you have got you a ripe watermelon. You have got 2 chances to 1 against you, as Grandpa said. It's true in everything. Grandpa thumped the watermelon. He thumped it hard. He didn't say nothing, but I was watching his face close, and he didn't shake his head, which was a good sign. It didn't mean the watermelon was ripe, but no head shaking meant he hadn't give it up yet. He thumped it again. I told Grandpa it sounded mighty near like a thunk to me. He sat back on his heels and studied it a little more. I did too. The sun had come up. A butterfly lit on the watermelon and sat there, flexing his wings, open and closed. I asked Grandpa if it wasn't a good sign, since it seems to me I had heard that butterflies lighting on a watermelon near about made it certain the watermelon was ripe. Grandpa said he had never heard of that sign, but it could be true. He said as near as he could tell, it was a borderline case. He said the sound was somewhere between a thank and a thunk. I said it sounded like that to me too, but it appeared to lean pretty heavy toward the thunk. Grandpa said there was another way we could check it out. He went and got a broom sedge straw. If you lay a broom sedge straw crossways on a watermelon and it just lays there, the watermelon is green. But if the broom sedge straw turns from crosswise to lengthwise, then you have got a ripe watermelon. Grandpa laid the broom sedge straw on the watermelon. The straw laid there a minute, then it turned a ways and stopped. We sat watching it. It wouldn't turn no more. I told Grandpa I believed the straw was too long, which made the ripe inside the watermelon have too much work turning it. Grandpa taken the straw off and shortened it. We tried it again. This time it turned more and might near made it lengthwise. Grandpa was ready to give up on it, but I wasn't. I got down so I could watch the straw pretty close, and I told Grandpa it appeared to be moving, slow but steady, toward being lengthwise. Grandpa said that could be because I was breathing on it, which didn't count, but he decided not to give up on it. He said if we let it lay until the sun was straight overhead, about dinner time, then we could pick it from the vine. I kept a close check on the sun. It seemed like it rolled around and just sat on the mountain rim, determined to make a long morning of it. Grandpa said the sun acted that way sometimes, like when he was plowing and figuring to go washing in the creek late of evening. Grandpa said if we got busy doing something and made out that we didn't give a lick damn about how slow the sun moved, that he would give up and get on with his business, which we did. We busied ourselves cutting okra. Okra grows fast, and you have to keep it cut. The more okra you cut off a stalk, the more you will have grow back. I moved along the row ahead of Grandpa and cut all the okra that growed low on the stalk. Grandpa followed me and cut the high okra. Grandpa said he suspicioned that me and him was the only ones who had ever figured how to cut okra without bending over or pulling down the stalks. All morning we cut okra. We reached the end of a row and there was Grandma. She grinned. "Dinner time," she said. Me and Grandpa broke into a run for the watermelon patch. I got there first and so got to pull the watermelon from the vine, but I couldn't lift it. Grandpa carried it to the spring branch and let me roll it in splosh. It was so heavy it sunk down beneath the cold water. It was late sun before we got it out. Grandpa laid down on the bank and reached deep into the water and brought it up. He carried it, me and Grandma following to the shade of a great elm. There we sat around it in a circle, watching the cold water bead on the dark green skin. It was a ceremony. Grandpa pulled out his long knife and held it up. He looked at Grandma, then at me, and laughed at my open mouth and big eyes watching. Then he cut. The watermelon split in the head of the knife, which means it is good, and it was. When it was opened out, the juice made water balls on the red meat. Grandpa cut the slices. Grandma and him laughed as the juice run down my mouth and over my shirt. It was my first watermelon. Summer eased along. It was my season. My birthday being in the summer made it my season. That is the custom of the Cherokee. And so my birthday lasted not a day but a summertime. It is the custom during your season to be told of your birthplace, of your father's doings, of your mother's love. Grandma said I was lucky and more than likely 1 in 100 million. She said I was born from nature of Monala, and so had all the brothers and sisters of which she had sung my first night in the mountains. Grandma said very few was picked to have the total love of the trees, the birds, the waters, the rain, and the wind. She said as long as I lived, I could always come home to them, where other children would find their parents gone and would feel lonesome, but I would never be. We sat on the back porch in the dusk of summer evenings. The dark crept down the hollows while Grandma talked soft. Sometimes she would pause and not go on for a long time, and then she'd smooth her face with her hands and talk some more. I told Grandma I was right proud of the whole thing, and right off I could tell that I wasn't afraid of dark in the hollows no more. Grandpa said I had the uppers on him, being born special and all. He said he wished he had been picked out for such. Grandpa said he'd always been hampered with a suspicion of being frightened of the dark, and now would totally depend on me to lead him about in dark situations, which I told him I would. Now I was 6. Maybe it was my birthday that reminded Grandma time was passing. She lit the lamp nearly every evening and read, and pushed me on my dictionary study. I was down into the B's, and one of the pages was torn out. Grandma said that page was not important, and the next time me and Grandpa went to the settlement, he paid for and bought the dictionary from the library. It cost 75 cents. Grandpa didn't begrudge the money. He said he had always wanted that kind of dictionary since he couldn't read a word that was in it. I suspicion that he had other using for it, but I never saw him touch it. Pine Billy came by. He taken to coming more often after the watermelons ripened. Pine Billy liked watermelons. He wasn't uppity at all about the money he got from the Red Eagle Snuff Company, nor the reward for the big city criminals. He never mentioned it, so we never asked him about it. Pine Billy said he figured the world was coming to an end. He said all the signs pointed that way. He said there was rumors of wars and famine had set on the land. Banks was mostly closed, and what wasn't closed was being robbed all the time. Pine Billy said there wasn't any money to be had hardly at all. He said that folks was still jumping out of windows in the big city whenever the notion took 'em. Out in Oklahoma, he said the wind was blowing away the ground. We knew about that. Grandma wrote to our kin in the nations. We always called Oklahoma the nations, for that is what it was supposed to be until it was taken from the Indians and made a state. They told us about it in letters, how white men had turned grazing ground up with a plow ground that was not supposed to be plowed. The wind was blowing it away. Pine Billy said he determined to get saved since the end was near. He said fornicating had always been his biggest block toward getting saved. He said he fornicated at dances where he played, but he laid most of the faulting on the girls. He said they would not leave him alone. He said he had tried going to bush arbor meetings to get saved, but there was always girls around them too that kept after him to fornicate. He said he had found an old preacher who was too old to fornicate. He figured because he was holding a bush arbor meeting and was preaching no holds bar again fornicating. Pine Billy said that this old preacher made you feel like at the time that you would totally give up fornicating. Pine Billy said that was what it took to save you, feeling that way at the time. He said he's going back and get saved. The world coming to an end and all. Once you was saved, Primitive Baptists believe you was always saved. If you backslid a little into some fornicating, you was still saved, and more than likely had nothing to worry about. Pine Billy said he leaned more toward the Primitive Baptist as his religion, which sounded reasonable to me. Pine Billy played his fiddle in the dusk evenings of that summer. Could be it was because the world was coming to an end, but his music was sad. It made you feel like this was the last summer, that you had already left it and wanted it back, and here you was all the time. You wished he hadn't started playing, for you ached, and then you hoped he wouldn't stop. It was lonesome. We went to church every Sunday. We walked the same trail that me and Grandpa used to deliver our wares, for the church was a mile past the Crossroads store. We had to leave at daybreak, for it was a long walk. Grandpa put on his black suit and the meal sack shirt that Grandma had bleached white. I had one too and wore clean overalls. Me and Grandpa buttoned the top buttons of our shirts, which made us proper for church. Grandpa wore his black shoes that he tallowed to shine. The shoes clumped when he walked. He's used to moccasins. I figured it was a painful walk for Grandpa, but he never said nothing, just clumped along. Me and Grandpa had it easier. We wore moccasins. I was proud of how Grandma looked. Every Sunday, she wore a dress that was orange and gold and blue and red. It struck her at the ankles and mushroomed out around her. She looked like a spring flower floating down the trail. If it hadn't been for the dress and Grandma enjoying the outing so much, I suspicion that Grandpa would never have gone to church. Not counting the shoes, he never taken much to churching. Grandpa said the preacher and the deacons pretty much had a chokehold on religion. He said they done the determining on who was going to hell and who wasn't, and if a feller didn't watch it, pretty soon he was worshiping the preacher and the deacons. So he said to hell with it. But he didn't complain. I liked the walk to church. We didn't have to carry our load of wares, and as we walked the cutoff trail, day broke ahead of us. The sun hit the dew on the valley down below and made tree patterns where we walked. The church set back off the road in a scope of trees. It is little and wasn't painted, but it was neat. Every Sunday, when we walked into church clear and Grandma stopped to talk to some women, but me and Grandpa headed straight for Willa John. He always stood back in the trees away from the people and church. He is older than Grandpa, but he was as tall, full Cherokee with white plaited hair hanging below his shoulders and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low to his eyes, like the eyes were private. When he looked at you, you knew why. The eyes were black, open wounds, not angry wounds, but dead wounds that lay bare without life. You couldn't tell if the eyes were dim or if Willa John was looking past you into a dimness far away. Once in later years, an Apache showed me a picture of an old man. It was Gokhale Geronimo. He had the eyes of Willa John. Willa John was over 80. Grandpa said that long ago, Willa John had gone to the nations. He'd walk the mountains and would not ride in a car or train. He was gone 3 years and come back, but he would not talk of it. He'd only say there was no nation. And so we always walked to him, standing back in the trees. Grandpa and Willa John put their arms around each other and held each other for a long time. Two tall old men with big hats, and they didn't say nothing. Then Grandma would come and Willa John would stoop, and they would hold each other for a long time. Willa John lived past the church far back in the mountains, and so the church being about halfway between us, it was the place they could meet. Maybe children know. I told Willa John that there was going to be lots of Cherokees before too long. I told him I was going to be a Cherokee. The grandpa said I was natural born to the mountains and had the feeling of the trees. Willa John touched my shoulder and his eyes showed a far back twinkle. Grandma said it was the first time he had looked like that in many years. We would not go into the church until everybody else was in. We always sat on the back row. Willa John, then Grandma, me, and Grandpa sat next to the aisle. Grandma held Willa John's hand during the church, and Grandpa put his arm across the bench back and laid his hand on Grandma's shoulder. I taken to holding Grandma's other hand and putting a hand on Grandpa's leg. This way I was not left out, though my feet always went to sleep as they stuck straight out over the seat rim. Once after we taken our seats, I found a long knife laying where I sat. It was as long as Grandpa's and had a deerskin sheath that was fringed. Grandma said, "Willa John, give it to me. That is the way Indians give gifts. They don't present it unless they mean it and are doing it for a reason. They leave it for you to find. You'd not get the gift if you didn't deserve it, and so it is foolish to thank somebody for something you deserve or make a show of it, which is reasonable. I give Willa John a nickel and a bullfrog. The Sunday I brought it, Willa John had hung his coat on a tree while he waited for us, and so I slipped the bullfrog and the nickel into his pocket. It was a big bullfrog I had caught in the spring branch and had fed bugs until it was practically a giant. Willa John put on his coat and went into the church. The preacher called for everybody to bow their heads. It was so quiet that you could hear people breathing. The preacher said, "Lord," and then the bullfrog said, "Lurp," deep and loud. Everybody jumped and one man run out of the church. A fellow hollered, "God Almighty," and a woman screamed, "Praise the Lord." Willa John jumped too. He reached his hand in his pocket, but he didn't take out the frog. He looked over at me and the twinkle come again to his eyes, this time not so far back. Then he smiled. The smile broke across his face, wider and wider, and he laughed, a deep booming laugh that made everybody look at him. He didn't pay no attention to him. I was scared, but I laughed. 2 tears commenced to water in his eyes and rolled down the creases of his wrinkles of his face. Willa John cried. Everybody got quiet. The preacher stood with his mouth open and watched. Willa John paid no attention to anybody. He didn't make a sound, but his chest heaved and his shoulders shook, and he cried a long time. People looked away, but Willa John and Grandpa and Grandma looked straight ahead. The preacher had a hard time getting started again. He didn't mention the frog. He had tried once before to preach a sermon regarding Willa John, but Willa John never paid him any attention. He always looked straight before him like the preacher wasn't there. The sermon had been on paying proper respect to the Lord's house. Willa John would not bow his head for prayers, and he wouldn't take off his hat neither. Grandpa never commented on it, and so I thought on it over the years. I figured it was Willa John's way of saying that he had what he had to say. His people were broken and lost and scattered from these mountains that was their home and lived upon by the preacher and others there in the church. He couldn't fight, and so he wore his hat. Maybe when the preacher said Lord and the frog said Lurp, the frog was answering for Willa John, and so he cried. It broke some of the bitterness after that. Willa John's eyes always twinkled and showed little black lights when he looked at me. At the time I was sorry, but later I was glad I gave Willa John the frog. Every Sunday after church, we went into the trees near the clearing and spread our dinner. Willa John always brought game in a sack. It'd be quail or venison or fish. Grandma brought cornbread and vegetable fixings. We ate there in the shade of the big elms and talked. Willa John would say the deer was moving farther back to high ground in the mountains. Grandpa would say the fish baskets yielded such and so. Grandma would tell Willa John to bring her his mending. As the sun tilted and hazed the afternoon, we'd get ready to leave. Grandpa and Grandma would each hug Willa John, and he would touch my shoulder with his hand, kind of shy. Then we'd leave, walking across the clearing toward our cutoff trail. I turned to watch Willie John, and he never looked back. He walked, arms not swinging, but straight by his sides, in a long, loping, awkward step. Always looking to neither side, misplaced somehow, touching this fringe of the white man's civilization. He'd disappear into the trees, following no trail that I could see, and I would hurry to catch up with Grandpa and Grandma. It was lonesome walking the cutoff trail back home in the dusk of Sunday evenings, and we did not talk. End of chapter.